Hi everyone, it's Mindrolling, Raghu Marcus. I'm back with Spring Washam. Spring, it's great to have you here and nice to meet
Thank
you too.
you.
I, uh, you don't even know this, but I'll tell everyone. I know of you and really have met you through Jack Kornfield. We were having dinner
Oh,
at Ram Dass's house about a year ago, and somehow he just mentioned you in relation to the Be Here Now podcast network. So that's our connection is through
oh,
Jack, our beloved Jack, and it's really glad to hear you, to have you here, and hear you, and also everybody. Spring works with Jack at Spirit Rock, one of the teachers there, and also you started the East Bay Meditation Center, which I want to hear about later. But that's also a wonderful accomplishment. But also, we have to mention A Fierce Heart, this wonderful book that you wrote. I guess that came out last year, huh?
yeah, yeah.
So let's just give us a little bit of a roundup of like growing up to waking up. What was happening and where was it happening? And give us an idea of that evolution.
Well, I was born in Southern California and I grew up kind of between Northern and Southern California. We would sort of travel back and forth a little bit. We are a bit like gypsies, my mother, my sister, and
Hmm.
I. And I, you know, I write a lot about this in the book, going through all kinds of different things and living on my own when I was a teenager. My mother had abusive relationships, so I lived on my own in Los Angeles, and all through that time, I had a lot of spiritual interests, mostly because of all the suffering around me. I got really interested in psychology as a teenager, and then that led me more onto the path of meditation. I started getting very interested in meditation. I started with Self Realization Fellowship, Paramahasa Yogananda School.
Hmm.
And then that led me on to just happening onto meeting Jack. As we were mentioning Jack earlier, at a retreat at a Vipassana course for meditation for beginners. And I didn't know who was having the retreat. And it's a funny story how we met. But I think when people ask me about the waking up process, it was really trying to understand suffering and why things were so painful and so hard. And that really was my awakening, was my own depression, sadness. So some way it's not a new story. It's sort of like it's a classic one.
But still, um, being in that environment that you were in, which was very very difficult to say the very least, it is not that usual for somebody to turn to an interior questioning and about suffering. It's more usual to get caught up in all of the things that we do to buffer ourselves from suffering, particularly around drugs. Okay, that's one major common theme for a lot of people. So yeah, a little bit more on what was that turn that you made to really investigate suffering.
I guess in some ways, I had a spiritual inclination
Hmm.
at a young age. I really did. Now, as I look back in the first chapter of my book, I write about when I was 5 years old, turning to my sister and saying, "This is going to be a tough life." This is, I kind of surveyed the scene of, okay, we have no money, we're black, my mother is, kind of a mess. My father left, all these difficulties. But in some ways, I think I had a real philosophical interest when I was young. I asked a lot of questions. I didn't get any answers. That was what was challenging, but I had a lot of questions. And
Hmm.
I don't know, I just started becoming, as a teenager, reading everything I could about self help and psychology. I somehow always knew it had something to do with my mind. that was really clear for me. Like something's wrong with my mind and something's wrong with the people around me's minds. And I would say that a lot. And so that's really what interested me, was I knew somehow the answer was inside.
Mm.
So that was something, I guess you could say, that was unique in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So I got interested in that, my
Mm.
mind.
Yeah. That is unique, especially in those circumstances. It's funny. I had a podcast, a chat with Adi Ashanti. I think you know who he is. He's in your
Yeah,
area.
yeah.
Beautiful man. And he said when he was a kid, he looked at all the adults going through all this craziness of suffering and playing out all of their neurosis, and he couldn't believe. He kept thinking, "What is going on here?" He really, like you, was like, "I got to find
Yeah.
out what is this," and he concluded at an early age, these people were insane. Okay. And I'm going to find out what really is going on. And that's what led him on his path. So, yeah.
Yeah, very similar. I had that thought almost daily
Yeah,
in
I
my
bet.
household.
In the book, you talk about cultivating a fierce heart is about learning to embrace it all, even the most painful aspects of our lives, every experience and all of ourselves. We have to open up to everything in order to transform it. We become willing to use every condition, challenge, and misery as a teaching, no matter how bad it feels or how dark it gets. And a lot of people espouse this. This is obviously not a unique notion. It is unique for you to actually embody this amongst those kind of circumstances. So I think that this book is a real testament to really having a real transformation to be able to come out the other end of this. I mean, really.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been a journey.
Mm. Um, so, we all know that the process of transformation is it's not comfortable for anybody, and that's why a lot of people back off and go, okay, or they take on this quote unquote spiritual persona, a spiritual persona that kind of bypasses the neurotic tendencies that we have. You want to talk about that a little bit, about how really working with transformation through discomfort?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the real message in the book, is how to open to that. And it is difficult in a lot of ways. I've been 20 years in the kind of Western Vipassana community, and there is a lot of bypassing going on. And I think there's two groups of people. I always say there's the group that kind of fly in from the top, you kind of they kind of float in a little bit, and they have difficulties, and of course we all do. But then there's those that have to kind of fight their way up from the bottom,
Hmm.
and they have to, it's like hard fought wisdom there, right? Nothing is given. There are no opportunities. You sort of grit it out and you learn from that. And I think I've always been one of the ones coming from the bottom. And so some people have opportunities where they can bypass, but others do not. The suffering is so acute and so apparent that there is no opportunity to there's no escape, right? It's there. And how do you use those moments? And for those who unconsciously, because I don't think it's a conscious thing to bypass, people really think they're on the path and they really are, feel genuine. But I think the sad thing, and I've seen this a lot in communities, is they plateau.
Hmm.
They get to, they initially meet meditation, meet the Buddha, meet the guru, have these great experiences, and then nothing after that, retreat after retreat. And they just kind of don't really change. The patterns aren't changing, the habits, maybe a little better, but not really. And so that plateau is something that I feel people are talking to me a lot about. It's
Hmm.
really predominant. I'm not really changing anymore. And
Hmm.
so that's how you're sort of kind of stuck. You don't really open, right? It's kind of the facade of opening, but not that real opening that happens in the beginning, where you just kind of you're just naked, right? There's an openness, and we get closed sometimes as we go along. We get bitter or we get disillusioned at the progress. It's a long journey, that's for sure. And so the bypassers are those that are kind of stuck a little bit on the sidelines. They imitate it, but it's not from the heart.
Mm.
It's not a real transformation anymore.
So, what do you suggest to students that talk to you about this?
Well, oftentimes when people are mentioning those kinds of feelings, stuck, plateau, it's not the same, is that I believe really it is a matter of the heart. It is something that is the love, the compassion, the intensity of the longing to awakening has to be this longing to open the heart. And so really we bring people back to that, having them do practices of metta, bringing them back to compassion practice so that they can live in the heart more, not just think about it, sort of disembodied or, getting intellectual. Those who are living more in the head, it is an sort of imitating, an imitation spiritual life in a way. It's like a house full of Buddha statues,
Yeah.
but no peace of
No
mind.
Buddha.
We have a lot of that. No Buddha inside, right? So I do think that this has, and that's why I write A Fierce Heart, is that to really open is to open the heart, is to feel, is to be willing to experience it all. And that only comes through one place. It's not in the mind, as you know.
Well, for me, another analogy for fierce heart is courageous heart. And I think that people, when they get stuck in these kind of areas, spiritual bypass is a very, very common. I think, in fact, we all, to some degree, are doing that in order to avoid pain. And the courage is the important component to being able to allow pain to be. And that's in the West, this is not something. That's why it's beautiful to go to India. It's so painful there. That's one good reason to go. Just go there because you're going to encounter severe pain in many ways, not just physical, just because it is so completely top to bottom, vastly different than what we're used to here. And so it's a good exercise. But we can do it here, and I think courage, fierce courage, is probably a good analogy. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, and I know going to India for a lot of people because they're forced to look at their mind. How are
Yeah.
they dealing with this intensity of life and death right in front of
Yeah,
you?
right in front of you. Yeah.
And you have to either open or you're going to suffer and you're going to feel that.
Yeah.
You're going to feel the hatred and the block and the
Yeah.
escape, wanting to escape. So India, she's a teacher.
Yeah, big time. So there's a friend of mine and I are doing something around. You know who Krishna Das is, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's, he and I were in India with Ram Das back in the day with Neem Karoli Baba, and so he's been going at different talks that he gives in between his chanting and stuff. He talks about we wake up in the morning to the movie of me. And so I said to him, you know what, we're going to expand on the movie of me is to from the movie of me to the movie of we is a progression, that we're going to talk about. I'm doing something with another friend. But then I read here, the mind spins all day long, generating one story after another. When we believe our painful thoughts, dark emotions follow, and a 4-alarm fire is triggered. Can I use that 4-alarm fire triggered thing? I mean, that's fabulous, Spring.
Yeah, sure.
No wonder we feel so much stress. We're constantly reacting to the nightmarish movies that are playing over and over in our heads. We're addicted to these dramas. Oh, I mean, so right on. Talk about that a little bit and how we maybe get out of that lock, which is a lock that happens, very soon after we are embodied in this incarnation.
Yeah, that reading comes from the chapter Prison of the Mind. And as I, write about that, this is our human suffering. That how do we get out of the nightmare? How do we wake up? And I tell people a lot that it really is about practice. The more we just practice the simplicity of present moment awareness. I don't know any other way. And those moments where the movies are playing, we just press the pause button, just pause. There is another reality. And the more we can just pause, I think the more we see, I have the power here to actually turn off the TV station. I can get up, I can, disengage. So these, um, these teachings are so simple but so hard to implement, aren't they? It's like, yes, just turn the channel.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so compelling, those dramas. Look at the world stage right now. It's compelling to be caught up in the stories.
Say
But
the very least,
practicing,
yes.
yeah, practice.
And the pause, you mentioned pause, and I think one of that circle of the Vipassana folks, Sharon Salzberg being who I'm thinking of, uses that a lot, and it's a great little meditative practice. As soon as you realize that you are caught, just like if you were sitting in meditative practice and you get lost and you come back to the breath, that's a pause. And you can do that in your daily life when you get caught in that movie. You can just take a few breaths and I'm going to pause now. I think pause practice is a good thing.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So, now something interesting with you, because you're deeply involved in Vipassana and teaching mindfulness and so on. But you're also somehow you got over to Peru where you just were. You told me before. But talk about that initial. What was that that drove you to the shamanistic practices?
Well, what's interesting, it was actually on a 3-month meditation course that I was doing, an intensive with Joseph Goldstein was leading it, Western Vipassana teacher that's on your network that you probably know.
Mm-hmm.
I was on a 3-month meditation retreat and I was doing concentration practices, jhanic absorption, and I completely fell apart. And I kind of fell apart in a way I never had before. It was in a way that I couldn't be mindful of it. And I knew I had a lot of trauma and I thought that I had worked through it all. I had done everything, sittings, blessings. I swam with dolphins, you name it, I did it to kind of move on from that. And when I kind of fell apart on that retreat, it was so destabilizing for me when I left. I left a couple of weeks early because I realized that sitting in the silence wasn't alleviating the symptoms. And I got really curious about trauma at that point. And this was 10 years ago. And many teachers aren't aware as they are now. I mean, as a community, we are learning more and more about how meditation affects trauma and how people with intense trauma experience their practice at certain times. This is it's a real evolution, I could say. We're all learning so much. Um, but 10 years ago, I didn't know what to do when I left the retreat. I had vertigo, my ears were ringing, I couldn't eat. I came back to California, kind of a disaster. And at that time, I kept feeling like this is so deep. I don't know how to access this suffering. I don't know what it is. But for the first time, I felt like I needed a different approach. And I was always interested in shamanism. And I ran into a psychologist friend of mine who she said, Spring, after I was sharing everything I'd gone through the previous months, she said, why don't you come and join a small group of us next weekend? We're working with this plant called ayahuasca, and there's a medicine man who's come from, I think he was from Puerto Rico actually. And why don't you join us? And she was someone I trusted. And she said, I've been getting so much help from this. And I was so desperate. I was like, what is this? Some Amazonian plant? And I thought, this is crazy. But I was so desperate enough to be open. And I went. And then that led me to then having an amazing experience, a healing one. And I decided that I wanted to go to South America and understand exactly what this could offer. And that's led to a 10-year odyssey, which I'll be writing a new book about, coming out, and healing trauma. And so that was my real interest, and that has really helped me over the years. And I started an organization, and I'm helping others now, but that was how it started.
Mm. And of course, using ayahuasca as a
Yes,
transformational device, so to speak.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Um, I don't know if you mind sharing this, but later on, believe uh, you went through some really tough stuff around your health, around a partner splitting up, and so on. Um, and I think that helped a lot. You say in the book around developing compassion and so on. But do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because that a lot of people can relate with what happened to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of one of those moments where, even on a spiritual path for a long time, it catches us by surprise,
Mm.
where we enter into the dark night. We're like, how could this be happening? I'm nice, I'm generous, and then there's a descent of some kind. And that's really a series of things happen. Someone I was madly in love with wanted to marry somebody else. And
Mm.
then I needed to have a surgery, and I wrecked my car all in about
Jeez.
5-day period.
Oh.
It was like everything unraveled. And I think that relationship just really triggered a lot of deeper feelings that I hadn't kind of dealt with, the attachment and all these different things. And I really fell for a period into a really dark place. And for those who are maybe experiencing that, I do always talk to people about the fact that this is a transformative place. It doesn't feel like it because you're dying in some way. Something is dying, and you really feel that. And to get through that without self-destructing is really key. And I relied on my spiritual practices then like I'd never before,
Mm.
to get through that compassion and loving kindness, and just staying steady with that storm that went on for a very long time. And then, of course, you rise like, the phoenix out of that. And then it makes sense later. I look back on that period a few years ago and go, wow, that was so profound. But out of that came, believe it or not, one of the most creative periods of my life.
Mm.
I finished a book, I started a new organization, all while I was, in my bed crying my eyes out. There's also this profound creativity started to emerge. So there's beauty in the dark night, but it's hard and it's disillusioning. And for those who don't have a lot of um, practice, it can be very, mentally destabilizing, to say the least. But I
Mm.
got a lot of help and support, and I got through that period. But I did write about that because I wanted people to understand that it can happen at any moment, this kind of descent, and then the rising out of that.
Mm.
There's always that journey of down into the underworld and then out again.
Yeah.
So
Just what you just said, though, you didn't spend too much time on it, and I did mention it, but I think it is the most important thing that anybody can do when they get into a dark period like this. Or even it doesn't have to be that radical or dramatic. It can be just something that happens, to you in the middle of the week that you weren't expecting. And that is the practice of compassion and loving kindness, metta. And for me, it's about as soon as you turn to do that, you stop thinking about yourself and you're thinking of others. And as soon as that
mhm,
happens, the whole world can change just on a dime. And now,
mhm.
when it's really dramatic, of course, that's not necessarily going to happen. But I'm all with you on having a regular practice that gives you some basis to rely on when this kind of suffering happens. So, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Um, I think you also went through this thing, which struck me. around prostrations practice, right?
Yes, another epic time.
Yeah. And that whole thing of what am I bowing down to? Faith in something bigger than anything I've known. And then all of your identity and everything you deal with in that sense. But I myself, and I've said it before on this podcast, I've told this story many a time. But I think the idea of prostrations or the idea of bowing down to another person, which is so anti-ethical in our culture, it is like a big no-no. And when I first went to India, there was one particular Swami that everyone's bowing down. And so I did what other people were doing, and I could not fathom it for a second. I didn't get it at all. And so Ram Dass showed up the next day, and I told him about it. And he said, look, you are just honoring the light in you, honoring the light in that being. And if you have any problem, wonderful, work with it, which is so.
That's great.
I went back the next day, and none of it worked. I was still in that same place of duality and polarization and everything. And then it was soon after that, within days, that I was in the Himalayas, in the mountains, meeting Neem Karoli Baba, and he came out, and I did a huge belly flop without thinking. It wasn't even a thing in my mind. My whole inner being went, okay. And you expressed it perfectly. I'm bowing to something that can never be destroyed. I love that line, Spring. It's the divine presence that's in us and in other beings. And of course, if you're lucky and you manage to get in front of somebody who is not in the I anymore, then it's even more profound. I too have within me the potential to be free. And you said in that moment I saw the jewel in the heart of the lotus, and it was my own goodness, my own compassionate heart, and that's indestructible. I don't know if you want. I've kind of quoted you from the book, but maybe you want to tell a little bit more about that experience, because I think it's profound.
Yeah, it was profound at the moment, and it became more profound later. But I was on with a group of friends, and we were doing a pilgrimage, across northern India, and that story takes place at the Buddhanath temple in Bodh
Bodh
Gaya.
Gaya, yeah.
Yeah, so there I am with 500 people prostrating, and I decided we were in the park just every day spending time, and I decided to offer 1,008 prostrations. And it was when I was doing them that this, like you said, this resistance, like what am I bowing to? What is this a joke? And all this doubt and anger and
Yeah.
real rage, like I don't understand this, and I just, everything was coming up. I did it over a 2-day period, and those insights came from the second day when I realized I'm bowing to the divine. And yeah, and it was a big moment for me. It was a realization that the Buddha is not outside. It's the Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's the jewel.
Yeah. So for those of us that have a lot of pride, go to India and go to any Tibetan or Buddhist temple and do prostrations and see what happens to your mind and everything that comes up. It'll be interesting,
Yeah, for sure. It's a
'Cause
great practice.
I feel like I'm making a big advisal here about going to India, right? You must go to India. Encounter your day-to-day, moment-to-moment suffering that's so transparent in this place. But I'm not doing that. I'm not telling people. I go to India all the time, by the way. It's my retreat. I've been going since I was there with Neem Karoli Baba all those years ago. So one thing, though, that we should talk about, and you do talk about in the book, it's about being in a marginalized group. I think that's an understatement related to what's going on, being black in America, being gay in America. It's just it's reared its ugly head in a way that's I don't. I mean, I guess it was just buried more, in the days that I was in the '60s and '70s when I was growing up. But it certainly is. It's really come out now in a way that's affected so many people. And so you talk about it's easy to forget your light and your innate goodness, especially if you're a person of color, LGBT, or someone in a marginalized group. We get trapped in lies that we and others repeat in the form of religious ideologies, white supremacy, misogyny, and other forms of discrimination. Maybe just talk a little bit about your experience and your ability to transcend it.
Yeah, and that's a really important question and a beautiful one. And it's really linked to my work at the East Bay Meditation Center.
Mm.
Because as we, opened up our doors, we said, okay, we're here to serve all beings. And all beings came. And that has, and, I don't identify as LGBTQ, but many of my friends, my community, but I am a Black woman. And so these issues and topics, they're coming up in Buddhist communities, but they're coming up in the world. I think they've always been up, but there's something being highlighted right now that is really painful, and it's really shadowy, and it's really unconscious. I think that's the better word for it. It's unconsciousness. And how to deal with that as a spiritual practitioner with an open heart, it has its challenges, to stay compassionate, to stay forgiving, because we're really forgiving the deluded mind, and I teach that a lot, and it's bittersweet for a lot of people to hear that. We're in a struggle right now, and I'm sure that struggle is not a new one. It's not. Read history, but it's a painful time for a lot of people.
Mm.
Mm.
How in the world does one manage this, though? I mean, all the way from what we're talking about being an African American simply in this country to so the anger that we also develop as just individuals related to what's going on politically in this country, the destruction of the environment, all of those things which really cause enormous suffering, and many of us are identifying with that suffering in a way that's counterproductive to perhaps initiate any kind of change. In other words, we're becoming like racists and misogynists. We are becoming very similar in our reaction to those that are in power that are putting this stuff in effect. What, yeah, can you comment on that? Because it's what we're talking about is across the board, the polarization.
Yeah. And, you know, for me, all I can do is look at this as a karma that we share. This
Mm.
is our collective karma. There's nothing more than that. And how you work with it, how you work with your mind, is the same. This is the intensity. This is the fire that we're all going through. And I know racism hurts people on many levels. I have many friends that are non people of color that are deeply troubled and absorbed and devastated by, what's happening. However, I think it's important, and I talk about this, in our community in Oakland, which is a huge amount of communities of color. And I
Mm.
started a people of color sitting group there. And I talk about in the book, actually, toward the later chapters, of 2 days after the election of Donald Trump, I was there leading our Thursday night group where
Mm.
there was 200 people of color there. And I'm trying to lead a meditation, right? And there's a riot outside,
Oh,
a
Jesus.
full blown, and there's helicopters and bullhorns shouting and 10,000 protesters destroying downtown Oakland and tear gas coming in. And it was so hot in the room. It was this unbearable heat. And I remember as I was sitting there, all I could think of was, what could I say? I look out at the room, there's African American, Arabs, Native Americans, Latins, everybody's there. And what does one say in that moment?
Mm.
And I could just only think of the truest things, like, this is a story within a greater story, you know, and we're playing these roles out right now. This is somehow important, but it's also relative reality. There is another one. This is a chapter in a vast book. And I really believe that. And for me, I look at it as the heroine's journey. Here we are in this brink of time. Didn't think I'd come here in this lifetime at this moment, at this
Yeah.
intensity,
Mm.
but I just open to it.
Mm.
And that's what I teach. Let's
Beautiful.
open to this.
Right.
Yeah, this moment in time.
Yeah, and taking a bit more of a macro view is not a bad idea
Yes.
either. You know, there's somebody you mention in the book actually, who I absolutely adore and love and spent time with in a similar way to you, Garchen Rinpoche.
Oh, yes.
Uh, to everybody out there, you can look him up. He is extraordinary Lama who is like everybody's mother. He's the mother you would hope to have. If you didn't have a great mother, he would be the one. Even though he's male, he has the most balanced Shiva Shakti thing going on. And I did spend time with him in Los Angeles, and he was doing some teachings and drove him around, actually, so I was really fortunate.
Oh, beautiful.
And so for those of you, well, you read Spring's book, but he was arrested in Tibet and spent 20 years in a Chinese prison, this Lama. And I think you mentioned this in the book, but when His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, was it His Holiness? Somebody asked him, how did he manage to not get angry at his captors? And he said something to the effect, there was only a couple of times when he found himself being at all angry at what had happened or at his captors or anything like that. For the most of the time, he went through the development of true compassion. Mm. And he just saw it as this was the perfect opportunity for that, right? I mean, if we could have 1/10 of the realization that's involved with that. I mean, so at the time, I was actually in the music business at the time, and we did the soundtrack to a movie called Tibet, Cry of the Snow Lion, which was all about the Chinese takeover. And it had some pretty rough scenes. So one night I said, do you want to see this? And he said, okay. So we sat and watched this film. And like I say, it has some very rough scenes, immolations and so on. I didn't watch, I had seen the movie, a billion times working on it, but I just watched his face and his expressions going through a myriad. I could see, what it meant to him, his people, what had happened, his ability to have compassion for everybody, not just the Tibetans and what they were going through, but the Chinese and what they had, and the karma that they were creating for themselves. Yeah, Garchen Rinpoche is something else, right?
Yes.
I don't know what was your experience when you met him.
Really beautiful. It was a few years ago at the Kala Chakra initiation, and he was previewing his movie about him, for the benefit of all beings. And so, yeah, people like him, they show me what's possible with the human heart. He's like a light bearer, like, wow, this is possible. It's not only him, also His Holiness the Dalai Lama's doctor also spent 20 years in prison. Came out similarly transformed, this compassion that they talk about. And so it lets me know that I'm just a baby in this, like a kindergartner with the heart and the capacity of the human heart. That's a fierce heart. Garchen Rinpoche, oh my goodness. Yeah,
That's a
that's
fierce
a
side. Yeah.
definition.
Yeah.
Amazing being.
Yeah. That's so great. Um, one other thing, of course, you do bring up, which we share a lot on the podcast with different teachers and so on, is of course another difficult subject for all of us: change. You're going through a change. You just told me you're moving. That's a change. You're having to
Yeah.
deal with, right? But um, yeah, so there is endemic suffering with change and resisting it and so on. Um, it's funny because in your book you say from moving from one step to the next, whether it's calling in something new or leaving a job or relationship or moving, you could have said in that moment, even if leaving is toxic, abusive, agonizing, it's painful to say goodbye. That's just, yeah, how we are so attached to our habitual patterns is staggering. And that's why making friends with change is a good thing. You want to talk about impermanence a little bit? I think it's important.
Yeah, and you're reading from one of my favorite chapters, Hello Goodbye.
Yeah, hello, goodbye. Yeah.
And hello goodbye. And I remember, having so many insights into the nature of impermanence. I think that's, and on retreats, that would be one of the most important insights I would have over and over again. I think sometimes we need to see certain things, and that one would just always appear, the fleeting nature, change. And I write about how it really hurts, even if it's something you can't stand and it's going, a relationship that tormented you is over, but there's still this part, our attachments, and so how to work with that and how to embrace change, how to open to it, how to be, dance with it, because it's such a fundamental truth. I think that's our task in some way, impermanence, the final teaching the Buddha gave. I always remember that. His last words: "The nature is impermanent." And so that has always stayed with me. Just a big important teaching in my life. Doesn't mean it's easy.
Yeah, well, we're
you
not
know.
talking about anything easy here.
Yeah, I still get caught up, but I let go much quicker.
Yeah,
I accept, okay, here we are
yeah,
dancing and now we're not. Okay.
yeah, yeah,
Such is the truth of the, reality here.
yeah,
So I can be with things in a different way.
yeah. And that's when people ask me, "Well, you've been doing this for all these decades and everything. What tell us what it is that you could say is a major change." Giving up shit a lot quicker is right at the top of the
Yes.
list. Okay, so for sure,
Gotcha on
yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah. But there is one easy thing, and you do mention it in the book, and is it the last chapter? I don't know if it's the last chapter, but love is the answer. No, it's the second to last chapter. Love is the answer. I mean, you may or may not know. I think you know because you know who Ram Dass is. That we come from the tradition of bhakti yoga, or guru kripa, the practice of devotional yoga and guru's grace. And grace is a whole other subject that we'll have to take up in another podcast. But yeah, that to me is one now, and we have talked about one of the most effective ways to move when you're in terrible, dramatic suffering, or at any time, but certainly then, is using compassion and loving kindness practices. But just the heart. I think that, and you've mentioned this just before in the podcast, that moving into and allowing the heart to be present in the midst of change, in the midst of impermanence, in the midst of realizing how caught we are in different ways. But yeah, love is the answer. Talk about love as the answer.
Yeah. I've been saying that for a long time because I've had a lot of insights whenever I'm struggling to accept something, a situation, a circumstance, somebody else's behavior. I just come back to that. Well, what's needed in this moment? I have all these questions. So really it's love is the answer, hashtag to all life's questions. That
Mm-hmm.
every time I'm struggling, it's like love spring. No, the mind. No, I will not accept this, or I will not open to this. And then I come back to that as the answer to the situation, and it doesn't mean I don't stand up for things. It doesn't mean that I'm not on the front lines. That's not the kind of love I'm talking about. I'm talking about something that's like the heart. It's a response of the heart, this kind of love. And it takes training in this. It takes, some people get it by grace, but then they have to keep kind of opening that door though,
Yeah.
to catch a moment of it. But that can be fleeting, right? And the door, we have to keep opening that door. It's not our habitual response a lot of times. But I love the fact that this way of being, I think it's coming more into our culture, even though it feels like the opposite is emerging. Like more toxicity in the response, more love too, though. This other quality I think is coming onto the foreground.
And just as important in my mind is Sangha. And Sangha in the Buddhist and satsang in the Hindu thing. And you have created this with the first, what is it, East Bay Meditation Center. You've created a very important Sangha, but I think for anybody anywhere, that is part, right, the Buddha said, when they asked what's out of the three jewels, which is the one that's most important, and he said Sangha, not Buddha, not Dharma, Sangha. And that to me is a great realization for people and a movement to make towards, and you call it the awakened community. Is I can't think of anything that's helped people more in my milieu and the stuff that we do with retreats that we hold in Maui and California and so on, that is quite as allows people to blossom when you're around like-minded people doing practice together or just sharing food, never mind anything else. So I'm glad that you, obviously I'm glad. It's nice that it's in the book though.
Yeah, something elevates us in those communities, in those moments. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Where like the highest part of ourselves comes out and we bring out the best in others. And especially when we're at retreats and practicing and, difficulties arise too. But yeah, I'm really blessed to have so many beautiful Sangha members, and creating community is something I care deeply about. I think Thich Nhat Hanh, he had a response when somebody asked him who the future Buddha was. And he said the future Buddha is the community now, right? It's an awakening of group of people. It's not one person now.
Yeah.
It's a collective of movement and energy based in groups of people. And it's just one of my most beloved. It's the jewel I cherish the most. It's my community.
Yeah, I'm totally with you, Spring, on that one. That's so great.
Yeah, your friends on the spiritual path. I'm sure they're so cherished, right? You've been with many of them probably your life, and God, they're so important to you now. This reverence for the Sangha has grown over years. I didn't appreciate it as much when I was younger. It's been over the last few years that it's dawned on me the insight into the value of spiritual friendships.
Yeah.
And mentor-mentee relationships, and it's grown, and it probably will continue to grow. This kind of respect and devotion to that.
Now, we will, in closing here, I want to mention that we will have show notes, and we will have ways for you to reach Spring through website, and the website is?
My website is just springwasham.com.
Okay. And
very simple.
Yeah. And for people who are, even though you're moving, the East Bay Meditation Center will continue.
Yes, it will continue, and that's in downtown Oakland. And I'll be joining Insight LA with
Trudy.
Yeah, so I'll be in Los Angeles doing events and programs, and
So everybody, that's an opportunity if you live either in the Bay or in the Los Angeles area. So you'll take advantage, and there'll be we'll put up the links to A Fierce Heart and I want to put up I didn't see the movie For the Benefit of All Beings. I want to see that. We'll put up a link for Garchen's
Yeah.
movie. And by the way, everybody out there, as far as other satsang and sangha opportunities, if you're in a kind of isolated place, or if you're in a place, maybe even LA, and you want to know where there's a satsang, please do write to us at Be Here Now Network, info@BeHereNowNetwork.com, and somebody will get back and help you out, okay? Because we have a Ram Dass fellowships all around the world, actually, so helping people just get together. So in the spirit of that jewel.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Spring. It was great to hang
Yes.
with you. I hope we meet in person. I'm sure we will one of these days.
I would love that.
And we want to see you back here. So thank you again. This
Thank
is
you.
Mind Rolling on the Be Here Now Network. See you next week.